I've always considered myself a pretty skeptical person. I've never bought into stories about ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. In fact, whenever I hear someone tell an unbelievable story, my first instinct is usually to think there's a rational explanation behind it, or that the story has been exaggerated somewhere along the way. That's why what happened to me a few weeks ago has completely shaken me. I wanted to write everything down while it's still fresh in my memory, because I honestly can't explain it. Even now, I'm still terrified by what happened. Hopefully, somebody can explain it, because I certainly can't. My friend Tyler and his wife were planning a weekend trip for their anniversary. They rarely get away by themselves because they have 3 kids and a dog. Sure, some people would call that a first-world problem, and they're probably right. But Tyler isn't hurting for money. He built a huge house out in the middle of nowhere because he values privacy. And honestly, I can't blame him. As luck would have it, everything lined up perfectly for them. Their kids were leaving town on a school trip, which meant only the dog would be left at home. When Tyler told me about it, I offered to stay there and watch the dog so he and his wife could enjoy a romantic weekend away. He agreed immediately, and the plan was set. I'd be taking care of his beautiful black Labrador for the weekend. I arrived Friday afternoon. Since I didn't work weekends, I planned to stay from Friday through Sunday. Tyler had stocked the house with plenty of food and snacks and made sure I had everything I could possibly need. It was a little excessive for a simple dog-sitting job, but I wasn't complaining. I love dogs, and I enjoy quiet weekends, so it sounded like a great deal to me. Friday night was completely normal. The dog and I spent the evening watching movies and relaxing. Around 8:30 p.m., Tyler texted me. "Don't let that house scare you when you're there alone. It gets pretty creepy at night." I didn't pay any attention to it, replied with a joke, and told him to stop scaring me. Like I said, I'm not someone who scares easily. Empty houses don't bother me, and neither does being alone in the middle of nowhere. I'm always aware that strange things can happen, but fear isn't usually my first response. Later that night, I went to sleep in the guest bedroom, and the dog stayed with me. We finally went to bed around close to 2 a.m. At exactly 4:12 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of the dog barking downstairs. Not normal barking either. It was loud, aggressive, and non-stop. I won't lie, it startled me. Not because I was terrified, but because it caught me completely off guard. I got out of bed and headed downstairs. The barking never stopped. When I found the dog, he was standing in the kitchen, barking at the basement door. Every hair along his back was standing straight up, and he looked genuinely frightened by something. I kept calling his name and trying to calm him down, but it didn't help. He wouldn't stop. When I reached for the doorknob, the dog became even more agitated. He started running back and forth across the kitchen, barking like crazy. My first thought was that someone had somehow gotten into the basement. It seemed possible, although unlikely. Tyler had a high-end security system, so breaking into the house wouldn't be easy. Just to be safe, I grabbed a large knife from the kitchen and opened the basement door. The dog immediately ran over to the entrance, but refused to go any farther. He stayed right at the doorway, growling into the darkness below, his fur still standing straight up. I flipped on the light and headed down the stairs. The whole way, I kept shouting out some silly phrases, trying to sound braver than I really was. But I didn't see or hear anything. I called for the dog to come downstairs with me, but he refused to budge. To settle my nerves, I decided to check every inch of the basement. Since it was a finished basement, I looked through closets, checked behind furniture, and even searched the bathroom down there. There was no sign of an intruder, and definitely no sign of anything supernatural. The only unusual thing I noticed was how unbelievably cold the basement felt.
I know basements are usually cooler than the rest of the house, but I'd been down there countless times before, and it had never felt like that. Even during the coldest days of winter, it wasn't anywhere near that chilly. Still, a cold basement wasn't enough reason to panic. I spent the rest of the night in the living room. After a while, the dog finally settled down, and eventually both of us drifted back to sleep. The next morning, he seemed completely normal. We spent some time outside playing, and I passed most of the day listening to music and watching movies.
At one point, I went down to the basement again, and everything felt perfectly normal. The temperature matched the rest of the house, and I didn't think much about what had happened the night before. As evening rolled around, I decided to sleep on the couch again, just in case the dog had another meltdown over the basement door. I planned on staying awake later, but I ended up falling asleep during a movie. Then, almost at the exact same time as the night before, I woke up to the dog losing his mind. He was barking non-stop like there was an emergency. I rushed into the kitchen and tried to calm him down, but for the second night in a row, he completely ignored me. What surprised me was that he seemed even worse than the previous night. I didn't think that was possible. Since I'd already checked the basement thoroughly, I kept reassuring him that everything was fine. It didn't matter. He acted like I wasn't even there.
When I reached for the basement doorknob this time, something changed. Instead of barking, he started whining and crying. It was one of the strangest things I'd ever seen. The moment I let go of the handle and tried comforting him, the barking started again. Frustrated and confused, I grabbed the knob one last time and headed downstairs. Just like before, the dog stayed at the top and cried, refusing to follow me. The basement was freezing again, exactly like the previous night. This time, though, there was another problem. The place smelled awful. I can't really describe the odor other than saying it was terrible. On top of that, several family photos hanging on the wall had been knocked down, and a few bar stools were lying on the floor. Oddly enough, nothing else seemed disturbed. I picked up the fallen pictures and bar stools and set everything on top of the bar. The smell was so strong that I didn't want to stay down there any longer than necessary.
After going back upstairs, the dog continued barking for another half hour or so, while I tried to figure out what could have caused that odor. Eventually, he calmed down. I gave him a treat, and not long after that, we both fell asleep. The next morning, I went back into the basement, determined to figure out where the smell had come from. It was completely gone. Not only was the odor missing, but there wasn't even a faint trace of it left behind. Even stranger, the dog followed me downstairs without hesitation. For 2 straight nights, he had refused to go anywhere near that basement. But now, he happily walked down there, like nothing had ever happened. I was completely baffled. I had no explanation for anything that had happened over the previous 2 nights. Tyler got home close to 2 a.m., and his dog practically exploded with excitement when he saw him. While Tyler's wife took the dog outside, Tyler and I sat down and caught up. He asked how the weekend had gone, and I told him everything was good for the most part. When I said, "for the most part," he gave me a puzzled look, so I explained everything that had happened in detail. I expected him to laugh it off and assume I was messing with him. Instead, he didn't laugh at all. He didn't even crack a smile. He just stood there silently. After a moment, he looked down and told me that when the dog was a puppy, he used to have episodes exactly like that. Every now and then, he'd go crazy, barking at that basement door for no apparent reason. According to Tyler, it hadn't happened in years, which was why he'd completely forgotten about it. They never figured out what caused it, but one day, the behavior simply stopped. The more he talked about it, the more unsettled he seemed. Honestly, Tyler looked far more disturbed by the story than I was. Tyler and I talked about it for a while longer, but in the end, I kept telling him not to stress over it. I figured there had to be some normal explanation, and that it was probably nothing. The problem is, it's been 2 weeks since then, and I still can't get the whole thing out of my head. Tyler told me that ever since they came back home, the dog has been acting completely normal. No barking fits, no staring at the basement door, nothing unusual at all. I've spent hours trying to come up with a logical explanation on my own, but I keep hitting dead ends. Every time I think I've found a theory that makes sense, something else about the story doesn't fit. When I look at all the details together, none of it adds up. So what am I missing here? Can somebody explain why that dog was behaving like that? What was that horrible smell, and where did it come from? Seriously, I need answers. I'm losing sleep over this, and I don't even live in that house. I just want some kind of explanation. This happened 3 to 4 years ago.
At the time, I had recently gone through a breakup and moved into a charming little apartment in a larger apartment complex. The property was beautiful, quiet, well-kept, and surprisingly elegant. Before long, I got to know several of my neighbors and became friendly with a lot of the other tenants. It felt like a small community where everyone got along. A few months after moving in, I was getting ready for bed one night when I thought I heard someone running through the hallway outside my apartment. Curious, I checked through the peephole, but there was nobody there. There weren't any children living in my building, so it seemed strange that someone would be running around that late at night. Still, odd things happen, and I didn't think much of it. Over the next several nights, I heard the same sound again. This time, I didn't even bother getting up to check. One detail that's worth mentioning is that my apartment was on the ground floor, and my windows overlooked a beautiful courtyard. The apartment door was located inside the secured building, meaning you'd need a key to get in. When I first moved there, it took some getting used to having bedroom windows at ground level. Technically, anyone outside could walk right up to them if they wanted. I wasn't particularly worried about any of my neighbors doing that, but it was definitely something I thought about when I first settled in. That detail becomes important later. One night, I suddenly woke up to the sound of faint giggling coming from outside my bedroom window. It was definitely strange, but my first thought was that some kids were messing around outside and happened to be standing too close to my window. Half asleep and annoyed, I tapped on the glass and made a loud shushing sound. The giggling stopped immediately. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then I heard a soft tapping coming from the other side of the window. That got my attention. It gave me a chill, but I wasn't about to let a bunch of kids think they'd scared me. After taking a second to compose myself, I grabbed the curtain and yanked it open. Nobody was there. The courtyard sat completely still under the night sky. There wasn't a single person in sight. Even if a group of kids had been standing outside, I couldn't imagine how they could have disappeared that quickly. I closed the curtain again and tried to brush it off. There was no way I was going to lose sleep over a bunch of pranksters. For the next several nights, the strange giggling outside my window continued. I have plenty of young nieces and nephews, and I've learned that the fastest way to end their harmless little pranks is to ignore them. That was exactly the strategy I decided to use with these mysterious giggling kids. My plan was simple. If I stopped reacting to them, they'd eventually lose interest and leave me alone. Unless things escalated enough to warrant a complaint, I wasn't about to bother the apartment manager over a few weird incidents. A couple of days later, while I was at work, I got an email from the property manager. The message was short and oddly serious. She asked me to stop by the office after work because she needed to show me something important. I agreed, but the email had me anxious all day. I kept wondering if there was an issue with my lease or maybe a problem with my rent payment. When I arrived at the office, she immediately asked me to shut and lock the door behind me. That didn't help my nerves. She lowered her voice almost to a whisper, and a security employee came in and sat beside me.
The manager explained that while reviewing surveillance footage, the security team had found something concerning. Then she played the video. It showed the hallway outside my apartment. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, two small hooded figures approached my door. Judging by their height, they looked like children, perhaps 8 to 11 years old. In the grainy footage, they stood directly in front of my apartment, barely inches from the door. That was unsettling enough. What really scared me was what happened next. The manager fast-forwarded the recording. The figures didn't move. For nearly 20 minutes, they stood completely still right outside my door. No shifting around, no talking, nothing, just standing there. Eventually, one of them reached for the doorknob and tried to open it. You could clearly see the handle move several times, but thankfully the door stayed locked. After that, both figures suddenly skipped out of frame and disappeared. That was when I truly started to feel uneasy. I told the manager and security officer about the strange giggling outside my bedroom window, but when they reviewed the footage from those nights, they found absolutely nothing. We still contacted the police and filed a report. The officers told me to call if anything else happened, but there wasn't much they could do at that point. The security officer also tried tracing where the children went after leaving my door. Oddly enough, they never appeared on any other camera in the entire complex. It was almost as if they had vanished. The following night, I decided to stay awake and catch them if they came back. But nothing happened. No laughter, no footsteps, no sounds in the hallway. About 2 weeks passed before I heard anything again. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard a noise coming from outside my apartment. I muted the TV and listened carefully. Then I heard my doorknob rattling. They were back. My heart started racing as I rushed to the door and yelled for them to leave.
That's when I heard a child giggle. Then another soft voice quietly said, "Mom, we're home. Just open the door and let us in." I froze. Instead of answering, I looked through the peephole. The same two small figures stood outside with their heads lowered. A moment later, the voice came again. "Please let us in. We're home now. Please." That last "please" sounded strangely desperate. I didn't care. I shouted that their mother didn't live there and that I was calling the police. Both children immediately started giggling again. Then the doorknob began shaking harder. One of them started throwing their body against the door, trying to force it open. Thankfully, it didn't move. I stood there holding my position, listening. Then everything stopped. The laughter disappeared. The doorknob stopped moving. The hallway went silent. When I checked through the peephole again, nobody was there. Even then, I was too scared to open the door. I kept thinking they might be standing somewhere just outside my view. I called the police once more. The officers assumed it was probably local kids pulling a prank. Honestly, that seemed like the most logical explanation, so I didn't argue. I gave my statement, answered their questions, and eventually the whole thing was considered closed. A few days later, I happened to run into the apartment manager in the parking lot. She stopped me and quietly asked whether anything unusual had happened since the last incident. I told her no and said I was pretty sure it had all been some neighborhood kids playing a prank. The look on her face immediately changed. She told me she wasn't convinced that was the explanation. According to her, the woman who had lived in my apartment before me had been unusual. She was careful with her words and avoided giving too many details for privacy reasons. But she hinted that something terrible had happened involving that woman's children. She never explained exactly what she meant. She didn't tell me names, dates, or specifics. All she did was suggest that something tragic had occurred and leave it at that. She said she'd already shared more than she probably should have and didn't want to get into trouble for discussing a former tenant. Before walking away, she told me to stay cautious and keep my doors locked. I'll never forget her final words. This wasn't a prank. As far as I know, those kids never came back to my apartment after that. Over the years, I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out who they were and what exactly the manager had been implying. Was she suggesting they were ghosts?
I know how ridiculous this sounds, and I don't believe it myself. Still, I have to admit that the whole situation was strange. What bothers me most is that neither the police nor the security team could figure out where the kids went after leaving my door. And there was another detail I didn't fully appreciate until after I moved out. The building required a key for entry. There shouldn't have been any way for random children to get inside. Like I mentioned before, there weren't any kids living in my building. So how did they get in? And once they left, where did they go? The more years that pass, the more unsettling those questions become. Looking back, I'm honestly surprised by how calm I was while it was happening. I don't even live there anymore. Yet, writing about it now scares me more than the actual experience did at the time. I still don't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. But I also can't explain what happened. The easiest answer is that they were neighborhood kids. But every time I replay the events in my head, that explanation feels less convincing. I realize how unbelievable this story sounds. Still, I think it's worth sharing. Maybe I really did encounter something that can't be easily explained. The following story happened to me about 15 years ago. Without question, it's one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. My wife was actually the one who convinced me to write it down. She said that maybe someone out there had experienced something similar. So, here's what happened. At the time, I was working a dead-end retail job. Like most people, I wasn't there because I loved it. I was there because I needed a paycheck. The routine was exhausting, and the monotony of retail work was slowly wearing me down. One day after lunch, as I was leaving work, I noticed something bright yellow hanging from my car door handle. It was a sticky note. Written on it was a simple message. I hope you know how special you are. Wishing you an amazing day. There was even a smiley face sticker attached. It caught me off guard and honestly made me smile. At the time, I just thought it was a nice gesture and didn't think much more about it. But over the next week, whenever I came home from work, I kept finding new notes in exactly the same spot. A lot of people I've told this story to think that's creepy. Maybe it was. But at the time, I enjoyed it. I wasn't getting much positive attention in my life back then, so it felt good knowing someone had noticed me. After receiving 5 or 6 of these friendly messages, I decided to leave a note of my own. One morning before work, I took a sticker and left a note on my car door. I kept it friendly, but added just enough playful flirting to see what would happen. When I got off work later that day, another note was waiting for me, and judging by what was written on it, my little flirtation had worked. Whoever had been leaving the messages was now flirting right back. I had no idea whether this was some elaborate joke or something more serious, but either way, I kept playing along for a few more days. The day before one of my scheduled days off, I left a note that said something like, "I can't promise it'll be easy, but try not to get bored without me tomorrow." When I got off work that evening, there was another sticky note waiting for me. This one only had a sad face drawn on it. At that point, I figured the whole thing was about to end. Someone had been having fun messing with me. I'd gone along with it, and now that I wasn't going to be at work for a day, I assumed the game would naturally die out. I couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, I spent some time around the house taking care of random chores. Late in the morning, I finally stepped outside. That's when I noticed something bright yellow stuck to my car door. Again. I stared at it in disbelief before cautiously walking over. The note read, "I could watch you sleep forever. It's so sweet." For the first time, I felt genuinely scared. After thinking about it for a while, I convinced myself someone was messing with me. It had to be a coworker who somehow knew where I lived. That was the only explanation that made any sense. I crumpled the note up and threw it away.
Over the next few days, the notes kept appearing at work. At first, they remained friendly, but after I stopped responding, the tone changed. Instead of compliments, I started finding notes that said things like, "You'd better text me back," and "Keep that in mind. I know where you live." I considered calling the police, but I was still convinced it was someone I knew trying to scare me. The next morning, I decided to leave one final note. I wrote that they needed to leave me alone or I would contact the police. Honestly, I wasn't planning on calling anyone. I just figured that if it really was someone I knew, this would finally convince them to stop, or maybe reveal themselves. When I got off work that afternoon, my note was gone. More importantly, there wasn't a new one waiting for me. For the first time in days, I felt relieved. I was still curious about who had been leaving them, but if the notes had stopped, I was perfectly happy leaving the mystery unsolved. A noise somewhere inside the house woke me up during the night. Ever since finding that note outside my house, I'd been constantly on edge. I sat up in bed and listened carefully. About 10 seconds later, I heard something again. It sounded like a faint shuffling noise. I couldn't tell whether it was just the house settling or something far more concerning. Part of me thought I was imagining it, but I wasn't willing to take that risk. I grabbed a fireplace poker and slowly started down the long hallway that connected my bedroom to the living room. With every step, my imagination got worse. I kept picturing someone standing in the darkness, waiting for me. The truth is that even though I had a poker with me, I don't think I could have actually hit anyone with it. I've never been that kind of person. When I reached the end of the hallway, I stopped. Whatever courage I'd felt when I left the bedroom had completely disappeared. From that spot, I could see straight into the living room, dining area, and kitchen. I turned on the dim lights and carefully scanned the rooms without moving any farther. I was terrified. My mind kept creating images of someone hiding behind the couch or crouching in a corner. For about a minute, I stood perfectly still and listened. Nothing. No movement. No sounds. Finally, I switched the lights back off and quickly headed toward my bedroom. The entire walk back, I expected someone to come running after me. Thankfully, nobody did. Once inside, I locked the bedroom door and turned on the TV. I wanted something, anything, to break the silence. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, most of that fear had faded. I walked into the kitchen to pour myself some juice. That's when I saw it. There was a yellow sticky note attached to the refrigerator. Written on it were the words,
"You can't get rid of me that easily." Underneath was another smiley face. I froze. For at least 40 seconds, I just stood there and watched it. Then I bolted through the house, checking every door and every window. Every single one of them was still locked. I knew with absolute certainty that nobody had a key to my house. My family lived in another state, and I wasn't close enough with anyone locally to give them access to my home. Yet somehow, someone had gotten inside and left a note on my refrigerator. At that point, I stopped treating it like a joke.
I contacted the police and gave them every detail I could. They told me they investigated, but nothing useful came from it. According to them, a handful of anonymous notes wasn't much evidence to work with. They did try checking the security cameras in my workplace parking lot, but that didn't help either. The employee parking area was located along the side of the building, where there were no cameras covering the spaces. Eventually, the police concluded that the person responsible had to be someone who knew me. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have agreed. The problem was that note inside my house. I'm obsessive about locking my doors. I always double-check them. Because of that, I couldn't understand how anyone could have gotten inside. For the next couple of nights, I stayed with a friend because I wasn't comfortable sleeping in my house anymore. Together, we went to a hardware store and replaced every lock on the property.
The first night back, several friends stayed over with me. Nothing happened. Days passed, then weeks, then months. No notes appeared at work. Nothing showed up at my house. For a while, it seemed like everything was finally over. More than 3 months later, one morning I stepped outside to go to work and immediately saw that familiar yellow drawing on my front door. My stomach dropped. I pulled the note off and unfolded it. It read, "Looks like you don't want to keep playing." I called the police immediately. Unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do. After that incident, I installed security cameras around my house. Strangely enough, nothing ever happened again. No more notes, no more messages, nothing. To this day, I honestly believe changing those locks may have saved my life. As far as I can tell, whoever was leaving those notes must have had a key to my house. It's the only explanation that makes any sense. What I still can't figure out is why they chose me. Who was this person? And what did they actually want? Whenever I think back on the entire situation, it makes me feel sick. My mind always goes back to that night when I heard noises inside the house. If someone really was there, they could have been hiding only a few feet away from me while I stood frozen at the end of the hallway. That thought still terrifies me. What I don't understand is why they never hurt me. Maybe all they wanted was to scare me. Maybe the notes and the attention were the entire point. One of my friends once offered a much darker possibility. He told me that when I went back into my bedroom and locked the door, whoever had been inside might have tried to get in afterward. According to him, locking that door could have been the very thing that saved my life. I don't know if that's true. Honestly, I don't think I want to know. It's been 15 years since I found that last note. Nothing has happened since.
I've moved away, built a new life, and I'm happily married now. However, every time I see one of those bright yellow stickers, I instantly remember that incident.